Of course, that's what it's all about, right? There's going to be a lot of singing and dancing ahead of us before the elections 2019. And that's the biggest news story of the year in South Africa, the national election. And with it, of course, comes the campaigning, the promises, the slogans, and the singing, and the baby kissing, for that matter. But there are also rituals and symbols that attract the die-hard supporters to the political rallies. And the question we're asking is, what is so special and enticing about them? Clive Simpkins, a marketing strategist, and Tebogo Ditseho of Ditseho Media are here with me. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
And I've been thinking about this and reading and observing, watching. This thing happens everywhere in the world, right? As much as politics is supposed to be about serious business, making promises, policies, so on and so forth. That's the razzmatazz part of it. So how common is this around the world, Clive? You know, these rituals and the political rallies, the color of the political rallies.
You know, Tim, I think we've reached a point in South Africa where people are no longer going to be just pulled into the hype. Pulled into the Ford Rangers with loudspeakers on the back and bunting and food parcels and things like that. And what I have been thinking about recently is that in the United States, they weren't very politically aware people until Trump came along with all of his nonsense. Now, the US has become, to use their terrible term, a highly conscientized political group of people, as opposed to us, courtesy of 1976 young children in Soweto, for example, who are very, very politically aware. And I think that this year they are going to be looking at politicians and at these campaigns and at all the razzmatazz, as you say, that goes with them very differently.
Yeah, but, you know, what I'm establishing is that sometimes I get a sense that people think that it is unique to South Africa, this whole business of singing, of passing people through and so on. But let's call it the political circus, if you will. It happens elsewhere, doesn't it?
Look, Theresa May dances on stage. I mean, shockingly, and even when she came to South Africa, you had Trump doing that awful little jig with the Saudis. So I think we've exported the dancing overseas.
But you know, Tebogo, from your point of view, there are certain things that are regarded as important when political parties put their campaigns together. I know that political analysts are going to focus on the messaging and the policies and fact-checking and all of that. But logos matter, symbols matter, don't they?
Well, look, I see a political campaign as almost giving a business proposal over to a nation. So it's not necessarily, just about singing and dancing. So if you're talking about symbolism, it's very important. And one of the greatest symbolisms would be an endorsement. So when we're talking about the Barack Obama 2008 campaign, one of the greatest symbols was when Oprah Winfrey endorsed his campaign. That's a very powerful symbol. Now, I don't think the singing and dancing is a global phenomenon. Yes, Barack Obama went to Ellen DeGeneres and started to dance around, but that was to appeal to a younger audience, to attract them in. But the singing and dancing, specifically in politics, and when it comes to protesting, is very unique to South Africa. If you go to Zambia or any other countries, I've got so many friends in these countries. When they see us protesting, they ask us, if you're sad, why are you singing and dancing? So it's very unique to South Africa. And I think the symbolism of that is very important. But I think when we're looking at how long we've been in democracy, it's almost like 24 years. This year we're going to be 25 years into democracy.
Well, but there are certain things that are happening elsewhere in the world that come to mind. I mean, the military displays in North Korea, in China, for instance, and the use of uniforms in other countries, and going back to history, as terrible as it is, the rise of the Nazi movement in Germany, for instance. I suppose in the world, do they still use those types of things? I mean, including in the US itself, the placement of people whenever the American president speaks, so currently Trump, that they put certain types of people behind them and they must wave banners, and it's like a show of sorts, a spectacle of sorts that's put together.
You know, Tim, we are missing a trick, and that is that, as cliched as it sounds, in the United States, they dish out those tiny American flags. Yeah. And when you have thousands of those little flags being waved by children and by people in a crowd, you actually create the most amazing visual metaphor. The other thing they do over there, which we don't do here, is they get a really big-ass bus, and they brand the thing with whatever it may be, like in the British Brexit campaign, they had spurious information on the bus about the amount of the amount of money they would save, for example. So we are stuck in a bit of a groove with the way we do things here. And I really believe I saw a show where you interviewed a number of young men on the topic of what they really, really wanted from political parties. And it broke my heart that what came out of it was jobs. And you pushed them, but it came back to jobs every time. And I think young people today are looking to the politicians to say, we're not actually interested in all the showmanship and the BS. We want to talk about delivery.
Yeah, well, I'm still stuck on that for now. Let's take a look at the DA is also in on the act of singing when they were congratulating Mmusi Maimane, and Helen Zille also got in on the act. I'm not sure if we can play that clip if we have it. Let's take a look. Yeah.
Bare muso wa Zuma raufetola.
All right, and that is the DA. I would also like to take a look at the use of color and uniform, and this time around let's take a look at the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters. Let's see how they do it and what that means. We'll talk about it in a moment. Can you put that up for me? In the case of the EFF, for instance, they brought in uniforms, even for their representatives in Parliament. Does it mean anything to voters, that fact that they put on workwear, hard hats and red, and sometimes display some militancy of sorts whenever they agitate or try to propagate a particular view?
Absolutely. I actually think it does have an impact. It helps them to stand out and also to be relevant to certain target audiences. Also, the beret is also important because it's aligned to their revolutionary narrative that they're pushing, of which I would more coin it rebellious. They're very rebellious. And I think it works for them. I think beyond that, when we're talking about this conversation around singing and dancing, I think it's also linked to the misinterpretation of African culture, where people don't understand the concept, firstly, of culture, and secondly, that they have reduced it to singing and dancing. It is actually not that. It is the values of the culture, the culture of the youth, the culture of the townships, the rural areas, the urban areas, and the culture of your ancestors.
Yeah. You know, I'm actually not dismissive of the fact that people sing and dance at this thing. What fascinates me is the fact that people look forward to attending a rally for precisely that. I mean, was it local government elections when parties were competing on how many stadiums they could fill? Remember?
Yes.
They say we fill 2, we fill. I mean, these things count for something, isn't it? And people will travel over 1,000 kilometers just to be part of the atmosphere.
Tim, you know, if you break this thing down to the psychology of it, we process information either visually, so what we see, or auditorily, which is what we hear, or kinesthetic, which is what we feel. And a really well-orchestrated campaign will touch people at all three of those levels. And that's where you know that you have really good strategy behind it. And, I mean, all of the parties now have people who lead singing. Mbuyiseni and Lozi, for example, has a fabulous voice. I don't think Zuma has such a fabulous voice. But going back to what Teboho said, these iconic things, and the reddies particularly stand out because in a crowd, for example, when you get the sea of red, and although the Democrats in the US and the DA here talk about a blue wave, it isn't actually as Hugo Chavez reminiscent, those red berets, as it is here. It makes a very, very powerful statement. And I really think they're going to do very well this year.
You really do?
I really do.
Yeah, tell me how and what's likely to happen.
I think for an awful lot of white people, we're sick to death of the fighting inside the DA, the shocking treatment of Patricia de Lille, the fact that Helen Zille can't stay off her keyboard. She's like Trump, and she keeps making incendiary, inflammatory statements. And I think that with Patricia de Lille also starting her new party, that there will be a lot of people who are really sick and tired of the DA shenanigans who will potentially vote for Patricia. And if that vote is split, it's going to benefit the EFF.
And where will the EFF's growth be coming from? You think at whose expense, rather?
I think that the EFF's growth is going to come at the expense of the DA. And possibly also ANC people who are now tired of rhetoric surrounding land distribution, for example, and things like that. But a whole lot of stuff, I think we would agree as marketing people, is on the back burner right now because of the elections. Cyril Ramaphosa is walking a very, very gentle and ineffective middle line.
Okay, now the launch of the manifestos, how important is it to the electorate? Because over the next 4 or 5 months or so, right, the messaging will have to be repeated. But we place a lot of emphasis on the launch of the manifesto itself, as if people will remember what was contained in those manifestos. And I'm again looking at it from the point of view of people who will be at the venue, like, for instance, tomorrow, Moses Mabhida Stadium in Durban. I think people who will follow what the message was all about, the speech was all about, are the ones who will be watching on television, and not the ones who will be at the stadium anyway. But what is the significance of this big launch and the singing and the dancing and the color in terms of
singing and dancing?
Of course I do. Yeah, I wish I could be part of it. In fact, even now I thought of leading you into a song when we started.
I toy very badly.
Well, it will just let you do the alto or tenor part of it, and then you
take the bass.
You can leave the dancing to us and see how far we go. Yeah.
You've made a very important point, where you've juxtaposed very important elements of election campaigns. You have the long manifesto, which will explain all of the issues that are being addressed by each political party. And then you'll have the campaign slogans that are used by the political party. Now, the problem that I've seen already with the DA's election strategy, besides the fact that it seems like they borrowed it from the person who just won the Congo elections, Felix Tshisekedi, they borrowed the One Congo United for a Brighter Future thing. They said it's One South Africa for All, which is a mixture of that and the ANC's old election campaign. The problem with that is that they're not going to be able to look at that beautiful speech that will be written about One South Africa for All. You know, it's a united slogan, and it's also talking about the perspectives. Whether you're in a rural area or a suburb, you'll be in the same South Africa. But you need a long explanation for that. So when you're doing a campaign, the slogan needs to touch on the key priority area that is affecting the majority of your target audience, because not everyone is going to be watching your speech. And so it needs to touch on that: unemployment, poverty, inequality, unity, putting the people first, education.
Well, that is in the case of the DA, but in the case of the ANC, they are launching tomorrow.
Well, the ANC has had some interesting election campaigns. Some of them have been very successful. And one of the reasons, the most successful, was A Better Life for All. Now, when you say better life, you're talking about everything that matters to the person who's watching it. You can also take another route and talk directly about unemployment or jobs or inequality. But if you're talking unity, that's important, but it's not a priority area for somebody who is...
I understand it. I want to differentiate the messaging now, because each party will approach it the way they want. And they've not all launched, but we can see how they're going about it. You take the ANC as government. It's had a terrible experience over the past few years or longer, but Still, the polls show that they are going to win the election, most likely to. And this will be evidenced by the number of people who pitch up tomorrow, as well as the amount of deliberations everywhere about what the ANC is all about. What is it that makes people... I mean, I saw pictures on social media. I'm sure you saw the one of Minister of Cooperative Governance, Zolim Kiza, coming out of...
That little shack.
That little shack there, right, with flimsy materials around it, and a good story, I think it was captioned. And people criticized that, but still, there it is. So, you know.
Tim, you know, I think the EFF have done the most incredibly clever thing this year. They've spent the last 2 months going out into all sorts of areas, talking to gardeners, talking to garbage collectors, talking to people in informal settlements and so on. And even if they're not really going to use that information to incorporate into their manifesto, which they need to change because the ANC has essentially hijacked some of the original EFF pillars of their manifesto, the point is one of the strategies used in advertising is I ask you what the problems are, and when I come up with a creative solution, I feed back into those very statements, even quoting you, so you have this feeling of I was listened to and these solutions are for me. So I think the ANC's deficit this year is what both of you gentlemen have said. They've had nearly a quarter of a century at this. They've screwed up monumentally. There hasn't been delivery. So there's going to be enormous cynicism, particularly given the corruption and the Zupta inquiry taking place in terms of state capture. For example, I think people here have become a lot more discerning. They're not going to have the wool pulled over their eyes any longer.
And what's your take?
I agree. Now, if you look at the symbolism and the campaign strategies, the EFF is a very unique political party, because the name of the party is already a call to action. They don't even need a slogan for you to understand what they will be doing in office. The thing that's going to be difficult for the EFF is credibility. Now, it's not just about whether your campaign slogan is beautiful or it impacts me, but whether or not you are the credible person to implement it. So they need to now build credibility. It could be winning a municipality or governing one department or governing a province, so that they can build the credibility. That's when they will start competing with the ANC. But both the DA and the EFF are not currently competing with the ANC. The DA is competing with the EFF, and the EFF is going to try to compete to become the official opposition.
Well, but a case can be made that they're not going after the same target audiences anyway. Let's look at the big three immediately. What are the strengths and weaknesses so far that you've perceived, you're detecting in their messaging and the way they're going? They seem to be approaching this election, including the use of social media. What do you think?
For me, the ANC's biggest deficit going into this is they've had a period of nearly 25 years to demonstrate their ability to deliver, and they haven't. The DA, in my view, has really, forgive the blunt expression, pooped on their own doorstep, because they've had this constant internecine warfare within the party, which has really been very, very distasteful. Each party seems to somehow have a maverick. Within the DA, that's Helen Zille, who can't shut up, and within the EFF, it's Floyd Shivambu, who also can't shut up and does the most dramatic things. But I really do think that the EFF, if they are able to present an image of a slightly more constrained and restrained and leadership-focused message to the people, will actually succeed in attracting a lot of votes. What a lot of people are afraid of is when you see these wild statements off the platform, off the side of their truck, for example, it panics white people. Bottom line to it. And they could definitely attract white people with their manifesto if the rhetoric was actually less inflammatory.
I would like to add there, because what Felix is saying, what Clive is saying is very important. Now, if I wouldn't racialize the politics of the EFF when we're talking about increasing their popularity. When we talk about being diplomatic, being rational, and attacking debates without being rebellious, and using rebellion as your only strategy, it's not just going to attract white people. even black people will be attracted to that. So one of their greatest challenges is going back to credibility and being able to rationalize, and talking to people and getting headlines for your policy positions, attacking, obviously the DA and the ANC in a policy perspective, attacking the ANC's history of service delivery, and talking about how they're going to change it.
Here's another interesting phenomenon, a development for the ANC anyway, that it appears to be in a difficulty of resolving the Jacob Zuma effect, right? Because it's seen, this is a Cyril Ramaphosa moment. Tomorrow he's unveiling the manifesto, he's the president, and tomorrow that's going to be his message. Whatever is presented is going to be seen as the promises of Cyril Ramaphosa. But when he's mobilizing in KZN, and then he has to deal with former President Jacob Zuma, then it confuses people who were thinking or are sympathetic to him and say, give the ANC another chance because Cyril is there. How do you think the ANC ultimately is likely to resolve that, if it has to, or it doesn't have to? I don't know.
America's very big on optics. You mentioned it earlier, where they put people behind Trump, and there was that delicious moment where that kid was rolling his eyes and making all sorts of funny faces as he disagreed, and they came and took him away and put in someone who did the ritual applauding. So the optics of having former President Zuma sitting next to Cyril Ramaphosa is totally wrong. They should have said, no, you cannot do this. You've had your moment in the limelight. You may sit certainly behind, but you cannot do this, because it's almost creating the optics and the visual impression of two centers of power, which of course we know there are in fact two centers of power, but one shouldn't explicitly allow people to see that.
Now, the use of the tag African as part of the names of the political parties, and plenty of them have emerged, and I love the names that have come through. I don't know what your favorite is. This content, I nearly said content management. It's African Content Movement.
The ATM, I think.
And then there's the African Transformation Movement, ATM, which, it appears it has been around for some time, and I read somewhere somebody complaining that this, because the media is not covering this, people don't know. But Mzwanele Manyi did the ATM a great favor of sorts to drawing attention to the ATM, as it were. What did you think of his move and the announcement last week on social media that I've got an important history-making move to announce, and then ultimately it was about ATM?
I think we might see an ATM bombing. I think we might see an ATM bombing. I don't think.
Good metaphor.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to work to a great degree, and I'll explain why. The first reason is, when you are developing your strategy and your messaging, it needs to speak to what are the core challenges of your target audience. In as much as African content is important to the person who is pouring petrol at the petrol station, it's not the first thing that he's thinking about. He's thinking about putting food on the table, sending his kids to school, healthcare, important issues like finding a new job or getting a higher salary. They're not thinking about African content. And if you're talking the decolonization, very important. But that's the means to the end. When you're communicating with voters, you must get straight to the end, and then you'll explain the means to the end later. So even if I said African education...
Yeah, but the question that I'm asking is that, is the move by Mzwanele Manyi in any event improve the chances of the ATM?
No. Well, the chances of them getting 3 seats, maybe. But it's not going to. It's not something like a mainstream conversation around the EFF and the DA and the ANC. It's not even close to that.
But what's the idea behind these many parties being called African this, African that, African that? Because I read one commentator suggesting that the whole point is to confuse the voter and take some support away from the ANC, because it's going to be surrounded on the ballot paper by this many African transformation, African content, African independence, African anything.
It is the case, and there has been confusion. We know from the last elections, for example. I mean, I can't remember the party offhand, that tiny African something that got 1 seat.
AIC.
AIC. Yep. got exactly one seat. So I don't know what the rationale behind that is, Tim. I think it's a kind of almost a nationalistic thing. But if I can switch gears for a moment, I think one of the huge mistakes we're making at the moment as well is assuming that social media is the megaphone of South African politics. And what we keep forgetting is that 13%, as in 1/3, of South Africans are on social media. A huge number of those young people on it, and I don't mean to be offensive when I use these words, are the woke and lit brigade. So they are very vocal, but all of us on social media, including myself on Twitter, are basically talking into an echo chamber, because the algorithm actually decides after a time what it is that Tim Modise enjoys, what he keeps liking, what he keeps clicking on, what he keeps retweeting, and eventually what you're getting is just stuff that is confirming its bias confirmation, it's confirming your current beliefs. So we are horribly overestimating the power of social media in terms of its impact in all of this.
Well, I would go along with you, because when you go with social media in South Africa, you'll think
it's a war.
Yes, and the number one question facing the nation is racism.
Yes.
Right? But when you go to Stats SA and you read what are following their research, they tell you about job situation, economic growth, people talking about health, people education, housing, and so forth. So, therefore, it suggests that to go by what you see on social media would not be a useful way to analyze or assess what's likely to happen once the elections are.
I disagree with that.
Yeah?
Because I am a part of the new generation who is very active on social media. It has a huge impact, on how the narratives are created. Because you have a media which now stares at social media and creates content, and then you find it, filtering into the newspapers, or you find it on the television screens. So it is highly influential. When it goes viral on social media, it goes on WhatsApp, and we haven't spoken about WhatsApp as a social media platform. Over 80% of South Africans have WhatsApp. So it's very powerful. It's a powerful tool, but it's not necessarily a direct mirror reflection of society.
So what's going to work in this election, or whether it works or not? What are we likely to see? What are the key features of the 2019 election that we should expect?
I think something that they need to implement this year is don't go out there. It's the point Tebogo made earlier. You cannot go out there with a manifesto that has 8 or 9 items on it. Nobody is going to remember that at all. You have to go out with one thing that people can really relate to, that will resonate with them. And they can feel, it's a very common term in communications called WIFM, what's in it for me. So I want to listen and I want to watch all of that stuff, and I want to feel this is what's in it for me. If I don't get that sense that there is some kind of advantage in it for me, I'm simply not going to vote. If I can just go back briefly to the social media thing, I agree with you in terms of the very lazy newspapers like The Citizen picking up on threads in social media. But if we look at what they're picking up on, 99% of the time, it's outrage.
Yeah.
Much as I dislike Helen Ziller on Twitter, she got one thing right only. I'll concede that for her, where she calls it manufactured outrage. And that's what Twitter is. It's a manufactured outrage machine.
Okay.
But we have to keep remembering 13% negligible.
I wonder if the optics will translate into any voter support or not. Who do you think is likely, if it were a contest, going to have a better impact optics-wise? One. Number two, will that impact translate into, it could make beautiful visuals and provide a great spectacle. Who's likely to translate the optics into voter support?
Well, one of the great optics that I've seen, and you mentioned a very important one, of waving flags and creating that atmosphere. We don't see it in South Africa. A great optic that I saw was in 2009 when President Nelson Mandela stood with the soon-to-be President Jacob Zuma at, I think it was Ellis Park Stadium, and said, I still support the ANC despite the fact that he's the president. That was a strong optic. But I think what the ANC needs to avoid is an optic of division, as you said, 2 centers of power, with the current president and the former president. If you want to show unity, you'd rather take someone like Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma and sit her next to President Cyril Ramaphosa. That's the kind of optics that might, create confidence. But in terms of the Democratic Alliance, the greatest monkey on their shoulder is going to be the fact that they're seen as black on the outside and white on the inside. They need to come across as inclusive and, there for the people of the country. And the only way they can do that is to be connected with the majority of South Africans. And obviously for the EFF, the greatest challenge that they're going to be faced with is having more of a homogeneous leadership. Try to break that up, get somebody who is, nice and not necessarily, I'm not going to say well-spoken because they're all well-spoken, but get someone who can convince them, someone in the leagues of like Thabo Mbeki.
Well, I tell you, there are going to be so many political stories anyway that can unravel whatever campaign that will be put together. We know with the Zondo Commission starting on Monday, for instance, you never know what's going to come out of there, and other stories that are being investigated. But be that as it may, we will sing, we will dance, we will listen to the promises, we will also cheer the slogans on, and the baby kissing will continue until election time. Clive, thank you very much.
Pleasure, Tim.
And Teboho, thanks again for spending time with us here.
Thank you.
So I suppose every supporter is looking forward to their own political party's rally and the nice time that's going to be had by all. And that's all that we had for you tonight. I will be back with you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for the special edition of the Modise Network. And we will be setting the scene for the 107th ANC birthday and the Manifesto launch. That will be tomorrow morning. News is next. Good night to you.